Hi there, my name is Dr. Marcus Bussey. I live in Australia and I work at the University of the Sunshine Coast, where I'm a senior lecturer in history and futures. It's a real pleasure to be with you today to give you a little bit of a run through on what it means to be an ancestor of the future. To me, this is a really key concept, and it links very, very seamlessly with the Neohumanist big picture, but also with the practicalities, I think, of applied living, I guess a sense of philosophy, perhaps you might say. Neohumanism is a philosophy, but it's also a practice. But we'll touch on that a little bit later. I've got a few points that I'd like to make, and of course this talk is actually only a short talk, so it's not going to take particularly long. Big picture. Over here we've got the Big Bang, and it makes sense when I say this, but you may never have thought it. You of course may have. We were at the Big Bang. All matter that makes this material universe was there at the beginning of everything. It wasn't in the forms that we see it as now, because it was way too hot back then. But this Big Bang has been flowing on, and it gives us the framework for this amazing story, this human story that we're living through now. Okay, and I just want to remind you that the great and famous Carl Sagan pointed out that we're all stardust, and as stardust, that means we are cosmic beings. And it's Michio Kaku who sort of talks about the evolutionary processes that sit behind this. And he said, look, the whole purpose of evolution from the universe's perspective is to come to know itself, and it knows itself through the sentient beings that emerge from this matter. Okay, so the human being is a witness to the universe. And as far as we know, we're yet to find other witnesses with the same reflective capacity as we have in this vast universe. But because the universe is vast, of course, we know that statistically it's very likely that there are many, many other planets with sentient and aware beings on it. But I want to challenge sentience in a minute. But this sense of witnessing means that we suddenly are able to see the universe. In other words, you have to step back to see the universe. In other words, you step out of the universe, in a sense, to observe it. And that's led to an interesting side effect. And so, in a sense, this awareness, this self-awareness that we have as a species has had come at a cost. Because in my books, and I teach this quite a lot, human beings are the lonely species. We are the species that stands outside of the realm of matter. We observe matter. We observe all the processes, the physical processes, the biophysical, the biological processes, and so on. And we become very good at labeling and categorizing and all that sort of stuff. And that means our consciousnesses look at the world as a set of objects around which we manipulate them to achieve our ends. So, having established that, I want to talk a little bit about consciousness from a neo-humanistic perspective. From neo-humanism's perspective, all matter has some form of consciousness. Okay? As Sahel said in his talk that precedes this one, evolution favours the efficient. What does that mean? Well, it means that rocks are less efficient, okay, vehicles for consciousness than protozoa. And protozoa are less efficient beings for consciousness than the human being. So the purpose of the neo-humanist story then is to reduce this separation that humanity feels, a separation from the observed universe. The subjective and the objective out there, we need to bring together some form of rapprochement, some way of being in but not of being part of but not lost in that being. In other words, when we're part of a culture, we can be totally French or totally Greek or totally Indian or totally Arisan or Tamil or totally, and we get down to smaller and smaller units like that. If we're in nature and we've observed an animal in nature, we can see that they are totally part of the grace that is the living biospherical world. But they're embedded in it. To our perhaps limited perspective, animals are not as conscious of their embeddedness in the natural world as we are, because we have separated ourselves from the natural world. And that's important to understand. So it's all about making us a little less lonely. So if we're looking at consciousness, then it can take two particular forms. Human beings, once we stepped out of nature, you might say, and stepped into culture, we started seeing everything in discrete bits. I already mentioned we categorize things and so on. So this is the analytic faculty of consciousness. But neo-humanism is a synthetic philosophy that takes us from that analytic point, that critique of the observed universe and the observed social forms we inhabit and so on, which we keep trying to better, okay? And it takes us into a more balanced relationship, as I suggested, between the objective world and a subjective reality. For me, this is the key to understanding what critical spirituality is about, because spirituality itself is the relational dimension of our consciousness, that synthetic aspect of our consciousness. But when we become critical spiritualists, or critically spiritually aware, we start to assess the quality of the relationships. So my relationship with the animals and plants, what is it like? Is it an equal relationship, or is it a relationship that's predatory for humanity's sort of seizing and grasping nature? So when we start asking questions about the relational quality, we're actually asking very deep questions that challenge the very foundations of cultural supremacy over nature. So then we've got brains that are first synthetic, I think, and certainly this is the sort of understanding of an embodied consciousness. This is me here, the whole of me type thing, and an analytic consciousness, which was the secondary form of consciousness that emerged out of cultural forms. I want to give you a very short case. Image of Patty Lather there. Patty Lather is a critical philosopher, a feminist, a critical pedagogue, and she's retired now. She's been writing since maybe the early 80s, late 70s even. I came across a really influential paper, influential on me, but also I think broadly influential in the mid 1980s at some point, where she talked about critical pedagogy, and critical feminism and so on. It was a really interesting paper, and it really helped me think my way through at a philosophical level how to teach better and why I do what I do intuitively. But, within a decade, she'd moved into something, for her, much more challenging, but obviously I think also much more rewarding. She began working as a sociologist with people dying from AIDS. And she was trying to use categories that she'd used comfortably to talk about something more objectifiable like social relations, to explain the what was happening to mostly these young men who were dying of AIDS. And she couldn't. She was lost for words. And she writes about this in a deeply moving way. And she started using metaphor to try and explain this. The metaphor was of the angel. So the angel speaks to that which is out of reach of analytic comprehension. For her, she had to turn to some traditional metaphor. She had to take something that she knew from the cache of, a Christian culture, for instance. She's American, North American, and she had to bring it into her conversation. And she was criticised quite a lot for taking this particular approach, but it was because she stood face to face with suffering and death, and her critical, analytical mind couldn't find ways of giving it language, giving it form. Okay, so I want to bring in the metaphor of the ancestor of the future. It's not my metaphor. I was very luckily at a conference in presentation in 2003 where I was on the panel with an Indigenous Australian woman, Maureen Watson, who passed away in 2009. Amazing woman, and really very deep thinker. And Maureen blew the audience away, who were all government officials. We were working with the Department of Family and Justice and Economics and so on for the Queensland government. And she said, "I want to remind you all that you're ancestors of the future." And of course this provokes us to think, if I'm an ancestor, what kind of ancestor am I? For her, if you think about ancestors, especially from an Indigenous perspective, you're stepping out of linear time, out of this narrow present, into an extended present of some kind. The image behind me now is an image that a friend of mine drew for me. I conceptualized it based on work of Elise Boulding, of the 200-year present, but I wanted to throw out the 200-year. I just wanted to suggest that there are presents behind us, presents now, pasts behind us, and this is plural, and there are futures before us, because we're all in unique trajectories and coming from unique different places behind us in terms of the ancestors that we follow from and the ancestors that we will become as we extend our timeline into the future. So there's this sense of folded time. So for me, I want to sort of give you a couple of points about, not a couple, I want to give you, 6 or 7 points now on, how I see neo-humanism working then, and its relationship with this ancestor of the future concept. Firstly, we live in or inhabit an extended present in which we are ancestors of the future, but we are ancestors with other ancestors, and that our relational networks are fractal. They go out in multiple ways at multiple levels. It's no longer this linear thing of grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, and so on. It's much, much more than that, because it's a relationship of responsibility. Okay, neo-humanism engages with our traditions, so creative traditionalists appear, where we take our traditions and we edit them to get what is rich and empowering and builds capacity for us to take it into the future. We can't go into the future naked. We always go into the future with traditions. In other words, some people quite rightly say that, if we're thinking business as usual, that the future is already colonized with assumptions about the future. But if we become actively engaged with our traditions, as Maureen Watson was with her Indigenous Australian traditions, thinking Laura Harjo in the United States, we're talking about Indigenous futurity. She's drawing on deep Indigenous traditions, but she's being extremely creative and flexible with them. It's fascinating to see this. There are challenges. Neo-humanism challenges the ancient sentiments of love for country and for associations of group, so sort of social groupings. It puts relationship before domination. It links action and reflection, and that's really important to understand. So there's a pragmatism there, which is the philosophy of linking philosophical concepts with the actions and the effects that they have. It links the world out there with the world in here, as I said a bit earlier, and it suggests a deep curriculum for life and for education also, which of course is why you often find neo-humanism being spoken about within the educational context. So I've got 2 more points I really want to make, and one's a sort of a shopping list, I guess, and it's to act across time, is to be an ancestor. Is to feel kinship with all things, is to be an ancestor that takes that as a starting point for action on behalf of. We take responsibility for our relational obligations. To be an ancestor means to recognize that each of us is a unique offering to this cosmic whole. We witness independently and individually as subjectivities. We have a subject macro object relationship with cosmic consciousness or cosmic being. It's to strive to deepen those connections on behalf of the whole, and it's also to love across separations that isolate us, to push back at those social conditionings that separate us into groups, into categories, whether it's a gendered category, whether it's ethnicity categories, whether it's categories to do with illness and or aging youth and the elderly, should I say. It's also about categories around dogma, being a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Hindu or an indigenous spiritual person or a New Age spiritual person. It's about pushing back on that and being able to love across that separation. And finally, to me, It means to live lives as ancestors of the future, to take everything seriously, which is why a Gurukul conference like this is about suggesting that we can think about education, formal, non-formal, informal, across a range of spectrums. It's about being transdisciplinary. It's about engaging with different ways of knowing the world. It's about being curious and exploring, allowing, but taking very seriously our commitment to the future generations and to the more than human that we inhabit, which is why I'm ending with that slide behind me here. Thank you very much.